Welcome to Cut the Crop, keeping you in the know about everything you grow. Researchers, growers and other interesting folk delivering insights and information on topics ranging from agronomy to profitability. Brought to you by the Foundation for Arable Research.
Hello and welcome. My name's Alison Stewart and I'm your host of this session of Cut the Crop. And today my guest is Abie Horrocks from FAR. And we're going to be talking about, I suppose, the outcomes from a 3-year project that's just completed, a Sustainable Farming Fund project called Good Management Practices for Setbacks on Arable Farms. So maybe just start off with talking about what actually was the point of the project.
It all kind of started when I first started working at FAR, and at that point of time there was quite a lot of concern going on around distances from waterways in terms of how far you can crop up to, setback widths, and were they relevant to cropping, and are they going to be effective, and concerns in that space. So we thought, well, we need to really do a bit of work that is applicable to cropping to try and get a better handle on what the risk is, how much soil is being lost across the rotation, how effective and how functional are these setback widths, and a bit of a bigger picture about the risks and management options to keep soil where you want it, which is on the paddock. So we set about putting together an application and got the MPI SFF funding. There was a lot of grower farmer engagement and interest in the space, and Colin Hurst is the project manager of the group, and we just got the ball rolling and off we went.
So just talk us through, like, what were the field trials that you set up?
We had 3 field trials, one in the North Island, one in Makikahi and one in Leeston. Unfortunately, the North Island trial was stricken by drought over the period that we were wanting to measure the runoff, and we had issues with establishing the setback there as well. So the results I'm talking to now are around the 2 South Island sites. We ended up talking with Steve Green from Plant and Food Research, who had done some work in horticulture, and we adapted the system that they had used, a really highly automated system, so that we could set something up that was going to give us something pretty solid.
A 1 metre setback, and you compared that with a 5 metre setback.
We had plots going into the farmer paddock, 10 by 3 metres, so that was, I guess, if you think about it like a mini catchment, and everything that was going on, anything that came off that area, we were collecting in a bit of a automated unit where we would just be able to come and measure not just the runoff that was coming off when you had a runoff event, but how much by weight, how much soil sediment was in that runoff event. We had a 12-volt pump to if you had a really high magnitude event and your containment, the primary containment area couldn't contain that, then the pump would get activated, flow meters to measure how much of runoff there was, and there was some proportional sampling to get an idea of the sediment load. So we were measuring moisture and had rain gauges, and we're just trying to get a really good handle on what the triggers were for those runoff events and sort of what was going on to result in there being a high sediment loads.
What was growing in the setbacks?
We had a perennial grass in the setbacks,
and you chose those particular species for what reason?
So ideally, you just want something that is perennial, that's going to have really dense cover and be close to the ground. That's known to have the best impact to stop that settle out that runoff as it's coming through, so that the soil doesn't go off to the waterways. And so that we chose a perennial grass, but there are other options, and part of this project was also to pull together a guide around how to keep soil on the paddock, and if setbacks are a solution for you and your farm, how to manage them, what best to plant. There's a number of considerations there. Like, for example, if you're wanting to put in a biodiversity planting to increase pollination or beneficials on farm, those plantings require a really bare ground underneath as the shrubs and what have you establish, and that's not in order to have also functionality around runoff. Then there's also some further thought that needs to go on around having a strip of grass, perhaps having some various other native or non-native species to do jobs on either side of the biodiversity planting. So there's a bit of thought that needs to go on into that, and the guidelines will help with that process.
So what were the key research results that came out of this?
So we found that setbacks, they do help, but they need to be incorporated into, I guess, a bigger, a more of a flexible approach around keeping the soil on your paddock. They are a tool in a kit, basically. And in terms of the actual amount of soil that we were losing through these runoff events, and there was about 5 to 8 runoff events per winter at these 2 sites, we did find that we actually had less runoff than what was expected based on what was in the literature from overseas. And I will just say we have some fantastic work already in New Zealand with sediment and runoff, but it's just really pastoral focused and a bit horticultural. So part of what we were doing here was like trying to make sure that these numbers were going to be relevant to cropping. And we don't have that in New Zealand. So looking overseas to where it has been done in other countries with cropping, the numbers were actually looking pretty low, maybe 5 kgs per hectare per event. 5 to 10 was the most standard amount of loss during a runoff event. And then we had a few sort of outstanding events where it was quite a lot more. There was one, which I will mention, in Makikahi, where there was over 200 kilograms of soil per hectare lost in a single runoff event. And that was because three I guess things coincided to create a bit of a perfect storm. There happened to be a record-breaking rainfall event in terms of intensity. There was pretty much bare ground in the paddock. The crop hadn't quite established yet. And also the soil was already saturated. It was at field capacity. So those 3 things together just meant the system couldn't, there's just going to be events sometime that beyond our scope of what we can manage. But generally speaking, the actual runoff load or sediment load was pretty good. We found some key things that we found was that surprisingly, a lot of what we found was what you would expect. For example, we found a very strong correlation with periods of fallow and amount of sediment loads and runoff. And, there's no surprises there.
Soil type, presumably, as well.
There's going to be a few things going on. We didn't have enough replication to do that, but just applying first principles. If you've got a sandy soil with good drainage, or a soil that's got good structure and you have good drainage, you don't get that pooling on the surface, which is when you get really vulnerable to those runoff events. And just thinking about avoiding those periods of fallow in your rotation or retaining your residue, because that's another thing that's really important here, having a bit of not having just a flat bare surface, having a bit of residue there is an opportunity. As a runoff event is happening, the water has these places to settle and sit, so that sediment can settle out, so that little mini dam effects, if you like. So thinking around avoiding those bare ground, avoiding the fallow periods. And there was also a very strong correlation with how much moisture content was already in the soil at the time of the rainfall events. And again, that's no surprises there, but it does make you think about how important it is not to have compacted soil. The more compacted your soil, anything that impedes your drainage, again, these things had a stronger effect than what we were expecting in terms of runoff loads. Setbacks, the bigger the setback, the more, the less sediment in the runoff. We had a 37% reduction from a 1 metre setback compared to a 63% in the 5 metre. not a linear response, but certainly a response there. But all these things considered, there's a whole lot of things that you need to consider around how you utilise your setbacks and the sort of width you want to be looking at. And again, the guidelines that we've put together and that will soon be available helps you think through where and how wide they should be.
I guess, from the grower's perspective, it's area that is not in a crop. And so the difference between a 1 metre and a 5 metre, there's a lost revenue opportunity there. And so you have to balance that out with the long-term benefits of, mitigating runoff and all sorts of things.
Yeah. And if you do put in a 5 metre setback somewhere, you want it to be put into that part of your farm where it's going to be making a difference, not a blanket approach across everywhere. And so doing those risk assessments and focusing on those critical source areas, and then other areas and other mitigations might be more appropriate. So it's just thinking through a bit of a plan to get the best bang for buck and to have the best environmental impact and keep the soil on your paddock basically.
So how are we getting this information out to growers in a way in which that they can see how they could implement these strategies on farm?
There is a lot of the findings from this project and some practical steps that you can take to do that risk assessment. It's really just, the risk assessment is just building on a farmer's own knowledge around how water moves and soil moves on their farm, because they'll know where those high risk areas are, but it's just adding in a few layers of assessment to actually identify where those are and then thinking through what the best mitigations are. So in the guidelines, we really clearly lay out what those mitigation options are depending on where the risk is and how the water and the soil moves in those areas, because there's a lot of options out there around how to do that. There's we also pulled together some of the fantastic resources that are already out there that where they're relevant to cropping. The Don't Muddy the Water app is a fantastic tool to try and gauge areas on your farm based on slope and soil type that might be more at risk. And it also actually allows you to put in a few mitigations and to see the modelled effect of those mitigations. So there's some really great tools. There's the landscape DNA physiographic tool, which gives more, you plug in your farm and location, and it gives more of a catchment perspective of what the risks of your catchment are, the receiving water bodies, if you like, and how potentially vulnerable they might be, as well as on-farm soil issues. And there's a great mitigations library. So we've in this guide pulled together a step-by-step process, utilised learnings from other projects and just tried to make it really compact and user-friendly to build on farmers' current knowledge so that they can build a bit of a plan around this, because this is something that will become a bit more of a regulatory issue. Our freshwater national policy statements, we now will have bottom lines around sediment and waterways, so it's not so just front-footing concerns around blanket rules and inappropriate legislation. The best thing to do is put a plan in place that is really effective, really applicable to your farm, and brings together a whole suite of tools that are available to make those decisions to make sure that you're not losing your soil from your farm.
So, I mean, if you were going to put in a 5 metre setback, then they would then start thinking about opportunities to be able to capture sequestration.
That's another thing. There's also work that Dairy NZ have done on how to actually value adds to your riparian setback areas in terms of other crops that you might be able to put in or other opportunities there. So there is all sorts of thinking around value adds, and potentially once we have a better handle on the sequestration terms, then yes, there's opportunities there as well. And again, as soon as you're bringing in multiple functions, you just need to be thinking very carefully about making sure you're not losing sight of, you actually want to make sure that you do have that dense ground cover so that you don't have your soil just disappearing through whatever you're growing for your sequestration. So there's a few things to think through, but there's opportunities.
And I think that that's the key thing, is that, with a bit of creative thinking, one downside, where you're trying to mitigate a risk to meet one environmental policy, you might be able to solve that problem and be able to get some sort of positive benefit that's being driven by another environmental policy.
That's right.
Because otherwise, it just becomes so incredibly depressing for growers that they just seem to feel as if they're getting hit left, right and centre. It's really good to be able to offer them opportunities where there's actually a bigger picture, and it's actually a positive picture, both financially and from an environmental point of view.
And actually, when we got this MPI SFF project up and running, we needed to put in a bit of something innovative that we're doing. So we included perennial grain as part of the mix to first of all get it into the country, and then to start seeing what sort of, because overseas perennial grain is being used for as a measure to keep soil in place or to grow it in steeper areas so that you're not having to cultivate every year. So yeah, there's other opportunities there that need to be looked into more. We just have multiplied it, and it's starting to look more closely at what it can do. But yeah, like you say, there are opportunities.
Great. Any final words of wisdom?
No, I think that it's just making sure that these thinkings are incorporated into business as usual. It doesn't need to be an onerous thing that is a burden to you. So just starting to think more about looking after your soil and using the resources that are there and getting on with cropping.
Thank you, Abie.
Thank you.
And thank you, listeners. Have a great day on the farm.
Thanks for tuning in to Cut the Crop, presented to you by FAR. If you'd like to know more about any of the topics discussed or have any suggestions for future topics, go to www.cutthecrop.co.nz.